Kestrel Vale buried her mother before the sun had fully climbed above the prairie. 6 days later, the front door of the small farmhouse opened again, this time without a prayer or a hymn. Silas Bragg, her stepfather, stood on the porch with a single decision already made. There isn't room here anymore. The last wooden chest that had belonged to Kestrel's mother crashed into the yard. Clothes spilled into the dust. Her younger brother, Nolan, rushed forward to save a folded quilt, but Silas pulled it away before he could reach it. Kestrel never argued. She knelt beside the broken latch and gathered the weathered notebooks left by her late grandmother, Maud Kettering. One of them opened in her hands as the wind turned a page. "The ridge remembers water longer than the valley." That sentence stayed with her, but it was the detailed sketch beneath it, a towering rock face defined by distinct familiar layers of stone that made her breath catch. She knew exactly which barren cliff her grandmother had been studying. And right when most people in Ash Hollow Crossing believed the two children would soon be begging neighbors for a place to sleep, Kestrel was already thinking about Rookledge Cliff. By the following afternoon, nearly everything that could be sold was gone. A worn wooden chest brought only a few dollars. A thin nanny goat changed hands for less than anyone expected. Several rusted hand tools added the final coins. When Kestrel counted the money in her palm, the total came to exactly $10. The news traveled through Ash Hollow Crossing long before she reached the recorder's office. Bram Whitlock, the owner of the largest dry goods store in town, assumed she had finally accepted reality. Renting a room seemed like the sensible choice. Reverend Asa Morrow, the local minister, quietly offered to place Kestrel and Nolan with the church family until they found steady work. She thanked him. Then she declined. Instead of signing for a room, Kestrel placed the $10 on the counter and purchased the abandoned tract known as Rookledge Cliff. The clerk looked up twice before writing the receipt. Outside, the laughter spread from porch to porch. Some shook their heads. Others smiled as though they had just witnessed youthful foolishness. A girl who had been turned out of her own home had spent her last $10 on a cliff nobody wanted. The climb to Rookledge Cliff took most of the morning. Every few yards, the wooden handcart caught on loose rock, forcing Nolan to lean his full weight against it. By the time they reached the upper ledge, his breathing had turned ragged. He looked across the barren slope and wondered how anyone could call this place a home. Kestrel never hurried toward the shallow recess in the cliff. Her attention settled elsewhere. She watched how the morning sun reached the southern face while the northern wall stayed in shadow. She traced the path where rainwater had once carved narrow channels through the stone. A steady breeze slipped across the ridge instead of crashing against it. Then she opened Maud Kettering's notebook. Red sandstone, pale limestone, caliche seam. Each note matched the ground beneath her boots. A patch of green moss clung to a thin crack, no wider than a finger. Kestrel crouched beside it without saying a word. Moss could not survive for long where water had never been. The cliff looked abandoned to everyone below. She was beginning to see something entirely different. It was not an empty wall of stone. It was a system that had been quietly keeping its own secrets for years. The first tool Kestrel unpacked was not the shovel. It was a small rock hammer that had belonged to Maud Kettering. For 3 full days, almost nothing changed on the face of Rookledge Cliff. She ran her fingertips across rough sandstone, tapped the surface with the hammer, paused to hear the echo, and marked certain places with small pieces of charcoal. One mark led to another, until scattered symbols covered the rock. Nolan watched in growing frustration. "We've been here 3 days," he finally said. "Why haven't we started?" Kestrel rested the hammer against the stone before answering. "If we choose the wrong place, the cliff won't forgive us." She struck another section. The sound came back dull. A few feet away, the next blow rang sharp and solid. The stone is already telling us where it wants to carry weight. Late that afternoon, a dry cracking sound drifted from a shallow pocket above the ledge. Both of them stepped back. Without warning, a slab of sandstone broke loose and slammed into the ground where Nolan had been standing earlier that morning. Dust rolled across the ledge before settling into silence. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. The cliff had delivered its first lesson. Waiting had not delayed the work. It had kept them alive. Once Kestrel chose the entrance, the real work finally began. Every inch had to be earned. One person chipped at the sandstone while the other hauled loose rock away in a canvas sling. After an hour, they traded places. The rhythm stayed the same from sunrise until the afternoon shadows reached the ledge. Dust settled into their hair, their clothes, and the cracks in their hands. By the 8th day, the opening had grown large enough for both of them to stand inside. That was when Nolan made a mistake. One swing landed too close to the edge of the entrance. A thin crack raced across the cornerstone. He froze. "I'm sorry," he whispered, already staring at the damage as though the past week had been wasted. Kestrel walked over, studied the fracture for a moment, then lifted the hammer herself. The damaged section came down in 3 controlled blows. More stone followed. When the broken pieces were cleared away, the entrance was smaller than it had been that morning. "We'll cut it again," she said. Nothing else needed to be explained. The next day, they started rebuilding the corner from solid rock instead of trying to save weakened stone. That evening, Nolan fell asleep before finishing his supper. His palms were blistered, and a fresh scrape crossed one shoulder where the sling had rubbed through his shirt. Kestrel remained awake beside the fire outside the unfinished chamber. Her eyes rested on the hammer lying across her knees. The plan still made sense. The measurements still matched Maud's notes. The cliff had not given her any reason to doubt it. For the first time, however, another question refused to leave her mind. She wondered whether Nolan had inherited a burden that should have belonged to someone older, someone stronger, someone who had already lived enough to choose this kind of hardship. The fire burned lower. Across the ridge, Nolan slept without hearing the wind that moved through the stone. Kestrel quietly pulled her own blanket over his shoulders before turning back toward the unfinished entrance, knowing dawn would ask both of them to begin again. Word spread quickly that the girl on Rookledge Cliff had finally started carving a hole into the rock. Curiosity carried a handful of townspeople up the ridge one bright morning. Orrin Bell, who ran the local feed store, arrived first. His teenage son wandered behind him, kicking loose stones along the trail. Orrin studied the unfinished opening and laughed. "So this is the famous buzzard shelf." The name drew a few chuckles. His son picked up a rock and tossed it toward the cliff face. It bounced once, then rolled past the entrance where Nolan had been working only moments before. Nolan took one angry step forward. Kestrel caught his arm before another word could leave his mouth. She looked at Orrin instead. "How far down is the water in your south well now?" The smile faded from his face. No one on the ridge expected that question. For several seconds, only the wind moved through the sandstone. Orrin shifted his weight but never answered. He knew the water had fallen nearly 3 feet since spring, though he had told no one outside his family. The laughter lost its shape after that. One by one, the visitors turned back toward town, leaving the unfinished chamber behind. Elle was the last to leave. Before disappearing over the ridge, he glanced once more at the narrow crack where green moss still clung to the stone. For the first time, the cliff gave him something to think about instead of something to mock. 3 days later, another visitor made the climb to Rookledge Cliff, Ezra Pike, a 72-year-old stonemason who had spent most of his life building bridge abutments, root cellars, and church foundations, carried no shovel and offered no greeting beyond a quiet nod. He simply watched. For nearly an hour, Ezra followed Kestrel from one side of the entrance to the other. He studied the charcoal marks, the tool cuts, and the direction of every fracture before resting both hands on the top of his walking cane. Finally, he spoke. "You're reading the fractures correctly." It was the first word of approval Kestrel had heard since leaving home. Ezra pointed toward the entrance. "The keystone belongs 2 inches farther back. Let the weight travel into the shoulders, not across the opening." He stepped inside and tapped the ceiling with the end of his cane. A faint crack answered from somewhere above them. His expression changed at once. Out. Kestrel and Nolan backed away without hesitation. Another dry pop echoed through the sandstone. Ezra kept his eyes on the roof for several moments before turning toward them. 2 more hours, he said quietly, and that pocket would have come down. The danger passed as suddenly as it had appeared. No one celebrated. Instead, Ezra picked up a piece of charcoal and drew a new arch directly onto the stone. For the first time, someone with a lifetime of experience was no longer watching Kestrel fail. He was helping her build something that could last. The chamber was ready before the first frost reached the valley. Its walls were rough. The floor still needed leveling. Fresh tool marks covered the sandstone, and fine dust lingered in every corner. Nothing about the shelter looked finished. Even so, it was enough for one night. After supper, the fire outside burned low, until only glowing coals remained. Kestrel waited a little longer before stepping inside. Nolan followed, carrying a single lantern. The air felt different, not warmer because of the fire, warmer because the stone had been holding heat since morning. Nolan reached out and rested his palm against the wall. His hand stayed there. "It isn't cold," he said quietly, almost to himself. Kestrel smiled, though only for a moment. She remembered Maud's note written years before. Stone gives back what the sun leaves behind. That night, the wind swept across Rookledge Ridge without finding a way inside. The lantern burned steadily. Neither blanket carried the damp chill they had grown used to since leaving home. Before dawn, Nolan slept more deeply than he had in weeks. Kestrel remained awake for a while, listening to the silence inside the chamber. The cliff had not become a home overnight. It had simply proven its first promise. And for the first time, since they had walked away from their mother's house, tomorrow no longer felt quite as uncertain. With the first chamber finished, Kestrel turned to the problem that mattered even more than shelter: water. Maud's notebook marked a narrow seep below the eastern shoulder of the ridge. If the notes were accurate, a small cistern placed at the right elevation could collect enough groundwater to last through the dry months. The excavation took another week. One cool morning, a thin stream finally trickled into the basin. Nolan hurried forward with a tin cup. His excitement disappeared almost immediately. The water was cloudy, thick with pale sediment that refused to settle. "It isn't any good," he said, watching the muddy swirl drift across the bottom. Kestrel never reached for another shovel. Instead, she spent the next 2 days doing almost nothing that looked like work. She watched the water enter the basin at different hours, scratched new measurements onto a flat stone, and followed the slow current with bits of dry grass. By the third afternoon, she heard heavy footsteps on the trail. Rafe Calder, the town blacksmith, crested the ridge carrying a heavy canvas roll. He hadn't come out of charity. He was delivering the hardened chisels Kestrel had bartered her last silver hairpin to commission. But instead of dropping the tools and leaving, the blacksmith stopped. He watched her drop another piece of dry grass into the muddy swirl. He was a man who understood the physics of heat and heavy hammer strikes, and he recognized someone trying to solve a mechanical problem. "You built a slide," Rafe said, breaking the silence. Kestrel looked up. Rafe walked over and pointed to the sloped floor where the water entered. "Your angle carries the water straight across that soft caliche layer. Every drop acts like a broom, sweeping up the fine dust." He unrolled the canvas, pulled out a flat chisel, and used its edge to draw a two-tiered shape in the dirt. "Don't let the water run directly into the main basin," he explained, tapping the drawing. "Dig a small, deep pocket right where the water first falls. A trap. Let the water crash into that pocket and lose its anger. The heavy mud will drop to the bottom. Once that small pocket fills, only the clean, calm water will spill over the lip into your main cistern." He handed her the chisel. The work remained Kestrel's. She spent the next day carving the sediment trap exactly as he had drawn it. The next morning, the water arrived again. It tumbled into the small, deep trap, churning the mud exactly where it fell. But by the time the water gently crested the stone lip and slipped into the main basin, the mud had been left behind. By midday, the surface of the large cistern reflected the sky like polished glass. Hope returned without a single celebration. The cistern had simply begun doing what it had been built to do. By early summer, life on Rookledge Cliff had settled into a steady rhythm. The chamber stayed dry. The cistern held clear water. Each improvement came from careful observation instead of luck. Down in the valley, small changes began to gather into a pattern that very few people noticed. The creek no longer reached the willow roots that usually stayed wet until midsummer. Grass along the lower banks faded from green to a dull straw color weeks ahead of schedule. One family deepened its well by another 2 feet. Another complained that ducks had disappeared from the marsh, where they nested every spring. Even the birds had changed their habits. Small flocks of teal circled once over the valley before turning north toward larger water. Every 7 days, Kestrel walked to the same bend in the creek. She pressed a fresh mark into a cedar stake, opened Maud Kettering's notebook, and copied another measurement beside the entries dated 1863. The numbers were becoming difficult to ignore. Distance from the waterline, flow width, depth at the crossing. One column after another drifted closer to the old record. That evening, after Nolan had fallen asleep inside the chamber, Kestrel remained outside beneath the fading light. She rested the notebook across her knees and looked toward the valley. "It's coming," she said softly. The words disappeared into the evening breeze. No one in Ash Hollow Crossing heard them. The drought had not arrived yet. Nature had offered no dramatic warning, no violent storm, no sudden disaster. Its judgment was unfolding one quiet measurement at a time. Summer hit Rookledge Ridge like a hammer. The sky turned a pale, cloudless white, and the heat radiating from the cliff face was suffocating. Despite the heat, the first cistern remained full of clear water. Nolan took that as a sign to rest. "We've got a full basin," he said, wiping sweat from his eyes. "We have enough." Kestrel didn't look at the water. Her eyes were fixed on the baked earth of the valley below, remembering the falling creek measurements from weeks ago. "One cistern gets us through a dry summer," she replied. "It doesn't get us through a dead year." There was no time to wait for confirmation. They immediately began cutting a second basin higher up the ridge, along the seam where the sandstone met the limestone. The work was brutal. The stone seemed to fight every chisel strike, and every basket of broken rock had to be hauled uphill in the blistering afternoon heat. By the 6th day, Nolan's body simply gave out. His shoulders sagged beneath a load of rubble, his knees buckled, and he collapsed against the canyon wall, gasping for air. Kestrel dropped her hammer and caught him. "That's enough," she said. He didn't have the strength to argue. He stumbled back to the cool shade of the chamber and fell asleep before the sun even went down. But Kestrel stayed outside. The rhythm of her hammer echoed across the ridge, long after sunset. Blisters tore open across her palms, the raw skin mixing with stone dust, until she could no longer feel her own hands. The measurements had promised a drought, and the second cistern had to be ready. Nature hadn't struck the valley yet, but looking at her bleeding hands and her exhausted brother, Kestrel terrified that the preparation alone might break them first. Across Ash Hollow Crossing, people searched the sky more often than they checked the ground. One good rain became the answer to almost every conversation. Bram Whitlock repeated it to worried customers while measuring flour behind the counter. Reverend Asa Morrow reminded his congregation that dry seasons had come before and would pass again. Abel Crowder, one of the valley's largest wheat farmers, finished planting every acre he had prepared that spring. The seed had already been bought. Turning back no longer seemed practical. No one was careless. Most were simply following the pattern that had carried them through every previous summer. Up on Rookledge Cliff, Kestrel made a different choice. She folded the sack of corn seed closed and placed it back on the shelf. The wheat seed stayed beside it. Instead, she filled smaller bags with tepary beans, collards, amaranth, and turnip seed. None of them promised the biggest harvest in a wet year. They promised something far more valuable if the rains failed. To give those seeds a place to grow, Kestrel and Nolan had spent the past month doing what seemed impossible, moving earth to bare stone. Basket by heavy basket, they had hauled river muck and dry soil up the steep trail. They stacked loose rock into a waist-high retaining wall along the lower ledge, packing the borrowed dirt behind it to create their first terrace. To get water to it, Kestrel had carved a narrow, straight channel from the lip of the first cistern directly down to the new dirt bed. To her mind, it was a simple, logical solution. Channel the overflow water into the garden for irrigation. Nolan spread the seeds across the first terrace, while Kestrel worked compost into the shallow soil. When news reached town, another round of laughter followed. "She's growing weeds now. Nobody fills a pantry with that." Kestrel never answered. She pressed another handful of seed into the warm earth and covered it carefully. The valley was placing its faith in the weather. She was placing hers in preparation. Months later, only one of those decisions would still have a chance to change the outcome. Rafe Calder returned to Rookledge Cliff a week later with another bundle of freshly sharpened chisels wrapped in heavy canvas. He handed them to Kestrel, without ceremony, then walked past the chamber and followed the water channel toward the first cistern. He stood there for several minutes. His eyes moved from the cistern down to the terrace below, then settled on the straight trench carved directly down to the new dirt bed. "This cistern is doing exactly what you built it to do," he said. Kestrel waited. He picked up a dry stick and pointed at the trench. "But this channel isn't right. You carved it to run water to your crops on sunny days. But when the first real storm hits, it's going to be forced to act as a storm spillway." Using the stick, he traced the path of rushing water in the dirt. And with a pitch this straight, it won't slow the water down at all. The stick slid farther downhill. "It'll send the whole force straight against that retaining wall." Nolan followed the line with his eyes. "If that wall gives way, the terrace goes with it," Rafe finished. There was no argument. The next morning, all three of them began tearing out the old trench. Stone by stone, they widened the channel, turning it into a proper spillway. They lowered the grade and lined it with flat shale to break the speed and scatter the force of the water before it reached the terrace below. The work lasted 3 long days under a relentless sun, and when they finally finished, the new spillway curved gently away from the stone wall, instead of driving a funnel of water directly into it. Rafe brushed the dust from his hands. This should hold. Kestrel studied the finished work in silence. Then, for the first time since leaving Ash Hollow Crossing, she asked someone else to judge what she had built. "Do you see anything else?" Rafe looked across the chamber, the cistern, the sediment trap, the terraces, and the stone walls. After a long pause, he smiled just enough to notice. Not today. Trust had arrived so quietly that none of them realized it had become part of the structure itself. It wasn't built into the stone, yet the settlement stood stronger because of it. The drought didn't just arrive. It strangled Ash Hollow Crossing. There was no gentle fading. By midsummer, the creek that once reflected the sky had baked into a jagged scar of cracked mud. The wind, instead of bringing relief, blew hot and relentless, carrying suffocating clouds of dust that coated the inside of people's throats. The wheat fields that Abel Crowder had stubbornly planted didn't just turn yellow, they withered into brittle gray ash that crumbled at the touch. The soil split open in deep spiderweb fissures, as if the earth itself was gasping for a drink. Livestock became walking skeletons. Cattle chewed on dry bark and fence posts, their ribs jutting sharply against their hides. The sound of bellowing, thirsty cows echoed through the nights, until one by one the sounds stopped. Panic replaced patience. Wells that had provided water for 3 generations started pumping up thick mud, and then only dry sand. Families didn't pack their wagons out of caution anymore. They packed them out of sheer desperation, abandoning their homes under the cover of night. The road heading west became a trail of ghost wagons. High above the suffocating dust, Rookledge Cliff stood in stark defiance. It wasn't a lush paradise, the heat was still brutal, but it was alive. The drought-resistant tepary beans and collards clung stubbornly to the dark, compost-rich soil of the terraces. The second cistern, finished just in time, held a steady reserve of water hidden away from the evaporating sun. Down in the valley, the remaining townspeople stopped looking at the empty sky. Instead, they stood in the choking dust of their ruined fields, staring up at the green terraces on the cliff. No one laughed anymore. No one called it youthful foolishness. The brutal reality of the dead valley had already delivered its verdict, and it was forcing them to look at the girl who had spent her last $10 on a pile of rocks. A week later, Kestrel carried 2 baskets of turnips and collards into Ash Hollow Crossing. The streets looked different. More wagons stood idle outside the feed store. Dust settled where livestock had once crowded the hitching rails. Even the conversations seemed quieter, as though everyone had begun saving words the same way they saved flour. Outside Bram Whitlock's store, Tamsin Whitlock stepped into her path. She looked toward the baskets before meeting Kestrel's eyes. "Do Do you still have water on the cliff? We do. And the garden? We've already started harvesting. Tamsin lowered her head for a moment. The answer seemed to settle something she had been carrying for weeks. When you bought that cliff, she said slowly, I told Bram you'd lost your senses. A breeze stirred the dust between them. I thought grief had made your decisions for you. She drew a quiet breath. I was wrong. Kestrel stood without speaking. There was nothing left to prove, nothing left to defend. She simply gave a small nod and handed over the baskets. I hope your well holds a little longer, she said. Tamsin managed a faint smile, paying for the greens before turning back toward the store. Neither woman looked behind her. Tamsin walked away carrying the harvest of a hillside nobody had wanted, along with the heavy courage of admitting she was wrong. And Kestrel walked the long trail home with empty baskets, carrying a quiet victory that needed no words. Tamsin Whitlock's admission broke the final barrier of pride in the valley. A few days later, the most desperate folks began making the climb up Rookledge Cliff, but they didn't come empty-handed. Coins were worthless now, so they brought the only currency they had left. A beaten-down farmer led 3 scrawny hens up the trail, trading them for a few gallons of water to keep his family alive. Hours later, Orrin Bell, the feed store owner who had once laughed at her, trudged up the hill. He brought a thin, rib-showing nanny goat, awkwardly bartering it for a sack of tepary beans. Kestrel recognized the animal instantly. It was the exact same goat she had been forced to sell for pennies months ago. Now, those animals lived on the cliff, and they survived because Kestrel's system wasted nothing. The hens pecked at bugs and the tough outer leaves of the collards. The goat chewed on dry brush. In return, their manure went straight into the compost piles, making the terrace soil even richer. The cliff had become a closed-loop ecosystem. But bartering couldn't save everyone. The first person to climb Rookledge Cliff asking for food without anything to trade was Lottie Crane, a widow raising 3 young children on the edge of town. She removed her hat, her eyes hollow. My youngest hasn't eaten since yesterday morning. Kestrel looked toward the baskets stacked inside the chamber. There was food. Not a great deal, but enough. She invited Lottie to sit while Nolan quietly brought out bread, a bowl of stew, and a tin cup of fresh, warm goat's milk. The children ate without wasting a single crumb, their eyes lighting up as they tasted the rich milk for the first time in months. Afterward, Kestrel opened a small ledger she had started weeks earlier. Every sack of beans, every turnip, every basket of eggs gathered, every gallon of water. She ran her finger down the columns, adding the figures once more. If she divided everything equally among the starving families, the stores would be gone in 2 weeks. After that, everyone, including Nolan, Lottie, and the children, would starve together. The numbers left no room for wishful thinking. Late that afternoon, Rafe stopped by to inspect the spillway. He found Kestrel sitting outside, with the ledger still open across her knees. She slid the notebook toward him. I can feed them today, she said quietly, but I can't feed a whole town until next spring. Rafe studied the figures before closing the cover. Then don't build a line of people waiting for food, he replied. Build a place where they can help grow it. The words stayed with her long after he left. That night, under the light of a single lantern, Kestrel opened Maud's notebook and wrote a single sentence beneath the last entry. Food disappears. Knowledge stays. She stared at the words for a long moment. The answer had never been to keep filling empty bowls. The answer was teaching enough hands to keep the bowls from ever becoming empty again. The meeting filled the back room of Bram Whitlock's store before sunset. Farmers, merchants, church elders, and landowners gathered around a long pine table that had witnessed years of arguments over fences, taxes, and grazing rights. This time, every face carried the same question. Kestrel arrived carrying a weathered canvas satchel instead of a speech. She emptied it onto the table. Maud Kettering's notebooks, creek measurements recorded week after week, watermarks carved into cedar stakes, crop journals from the terraces, simple figures written in careful columns. Nobody interrupted. The room grew quieter, with every page that changed hands. Abel Crowder leaned forward first. He compared the creek measurements with his own planting dates, then turned another page. The stream started falling before we finished sowing, he said quietly. We just didn't notice. Across the table, Reverend Asa rested both hands on the notebook without speaking. Bram remained silent. He studied the rows of numbers far longer than anyone expected. Every measurement matched what his customers had been describing for months. Deeper wells, lighter grain, thinner cattle, empty wagons leaving town. Facts had gathered long before opinions began to change. Kestrel waited until the notebooks came back to her. She never asked for sympathy. She never reminded anyone that they had laughed. Instead, she looked around the room and spoke with the same calm voice she had carried since the day she left her mother's house. "I'm not asking anyone to believe me." Her hand rested gently on the stack of records. "I'm asking you to believe what you can measure for yourselves." Silence followed. It was no longer the uneasy silence of doubt. It was the silence that settles over a room when evidence leaves nothing meaningful to argue with. The following morning, Abel Crowder was the first to climb Rookledge Cliff. He walked slowly through the settlement without saying much. He stepped inside the chamber and placed a hand against the cool sandstone wall. He examined the first cistern, then the second. Water rested quietly beneath the surface, untouched by the panic spreading through the valley below. From there, he followed the narrow channels that carried every overflow away from the terraces instead of through them. Nothing had been built by chance. Each piece belonged to the next. The terraces held dark soil while neighboring fields had already begun to crack. Tipari beans climbed their supports. Turnips pushed healthy leaves above the ground. The collards still stood firm beneath the relentless sun. Abel looked across the valley before speaking. "If we'd started building this when the creek first began falling," he said, "our wheat might still be standing." No one answered. There was nothing left to add. By sunrise the next day, 31 people gathered at the foot of the ridge. No speeches welcomed them. No applause greeted Kestrel. Nobody had come looking for a hero. They came carrying shovels worn smooth by years of use. Axes rested across broad shoulders. Handcarts rattled over loose stone. Picks, ropes, buckets, and wheelbarrows filled the narrow trail leading uphill. Kestrel unfolded a rough map of the hillside. She divided the work without raising her voice. One crew marked the reservoir basin. Another hauled flat stone for retaining walls. Others widened channels, stacked compost, or shaped new terraces beneath the cliff. Bram Whitlock arrived later that morning, with a wagon loaded with tools from his store. He parked it beside the worksite and quietly removed the chains from the tailgate. No announcement followed. People simply reached in, picked up what they needed, and went back to work. By midday, the sound of hammers striking stone echoed across the ridge from dozens of different hands. The laughter that had once followed Kestrel up the hill had disappeared. In its place stood something far more convincing: work. Autumn carried the first storm into Ash Hollow Crossing almost 5 months after the last meaningful rain. It wasn't the kind of storm people remembered for years. The clouds were modest. The wind stayed calm. Rain fell in a steady curtain that soaked the ridge without tearing it apart. Work stopped. Men and women gathered along the edge of Rookledge Cliff, watching in complete silence. The first drops disappeared into the terraces instead of racing downhill. Moments later, thin ribbons of water reached the stone channels. They followed every curve Kestrel had carved months before. The overflow entered the spillway. The spillway slowed the current exactly as Rafe had predicted. Water slipped around the retaining walls instead of striking them. From there, it continued into the cisterns. Only after both basins began to rise did the excess flow travel toward the new reservoir below, spreading gently across the broad basin the workers had finished only weeks earlier. Nothing failed. Not a wall, not a channel, not a single terrace. Ezra Pike stood with one hand resting on his cane. A quiet smile crossed his face before he looked back toward the hillside. He had spent a lifetime trusting stone. Today, the stone had kept its promise once again. Nearby, Bram Whitlock stepped toward Kestrel. For several seconds, he searched for the right words. She noticed him before he spoke. Then she looked past him toward the reservoir. "The east berm," she said calmly. "Let's make sure it's holding." Bram nodded. There was no apology. There was no need for one. Within seconds, everyone was moving. Some hurried toward the reservoir. Others checked the spillway. the terraces, and the retaining walls. Boots splashed through fresh mud, while lanterns appeared one by one as daylight faded. The storm kept falling. The system kept working. Nature had delivered its verdict at last. It wasn't written in words. It was written in the quiet certainty of water, flowing exactly where careful hands had prepared for it to go. Spring returned to Ash Hollow Crossing with a different sound than anyone remembered. Water moved through the reservoir instead of racing away after every rain. Fresh grass covered the banks that had stood bare only months before. The terraces along Rookledge Cliff carried deep, dark soil, richer than the thin layer Kestrel and Nolan had started with. Every season of compost, careful watering, and patient work had added another little measure of life to the hillside. The changes reached beyond the cliff. Families who had once laughed at the terraces began laying out their own. Some copied the retaining walls. Others built smaller catch basins beside their gardens. Children who had never cared about creek levels learned to check cedar stakes before planting. The knowledge had started moving from one pair of hands to another. Bram Whitlock no longer measured success by what remained on his store shelves. He opened his warehouse to hold shared tools, seed, and supplies that belonged to the community instead of any single family. Tamsin kept careful ledgers, recording grain, vegetables, labor, and water with the same honesty she once reserved for household accounts. Abel Crowder oversaw the reservoir, walking its berms after every heavy rain and teaching younger farmers how to spot weak places before they became broken ones. Rafe Calder spent less time at his forge than he once had. Many afternoons found him on the hillside, showing work crews how to shape stone, set channels, and sharpen tools that would outlast a single season. No one asked Kestrel to inspect every wall anymore. They no longer needed her standing beside every project. That was exactly what she had hoped for. One quiet afternoon, Nolan stood beside her near the highest terrace. Below them, people worked across the valley without waiting for instructions. A pair of boys repaired a small spillway. Two older farmers argued over the best angle for a retaining wall before testing both ideas with shovels instead of stubborn pride. Nolan smiled as he watched them. So, we won? Kestrel rested her scarred hands on the weathered fence, overlooking the valley. The wind carried the scent of damp earth across the ridge. She shook her head. No. Her eyes followed the water leaving the reservoir and winding toward the fields below. Nature only gave us more time. Nolan looked across the valley again. This time, he understood. The drought had never been the real enemy. Forgetting how to prepare had been. Before leaving the overlook, Kestrel opened Maud Kettering's notebook one final time. The leather cover had faded even more since the day she rescued it from the dust outside her mother's house. She turned to the very first page, where her grandmother's faded handwriting still read, "The ridge remembers water longer than the valley." Beneath it, Kestrel took a piece of charcoal and added a single line of her own to finish the legacy. And now, the people have learned to remember, too. Then, she closed the notebook. It no longer belonged to one family alone. The thing that saved Ash Hollow Crossing was never a remarkable young woman, and it was never an abandoned cliff. The turning point came when an entire community chose to trust careful observation over easy certainty, patient work over hopeful guessing, and knowledge that could be measured over opinions that could only be repeated. Long after the drought became another story told around winter fires, the terraces still held the hillside together, the reservoir still gathered rain, and the ridge kept remembering what the valley had almost forgotten.